He was just there to translate, they said. Yet Tom Walker staggers into the chamber covered in blood, wounds from the Grain's brutal cravache ritual, self-inflicted by choice. The aliens fall silent, mandibles clicking in newfound respect. In sacrificing his flesh to their ancient customs, this mere translator has accomplished what weapons could not, transforming mortal enemies into reluctant allies through the universal language of willing sacrifice. Ambassador Krell couldn't help but stare as the human approached the docking bay of the Celestial Peace Station. The bipedal creature moved with quiet efficiency, unassuming in both stature and demeanor. Nothing about Thomas Walker suggested he was anything more than what his credentials claimed, a coalition-certified translator. Yet, something in Krell's secondary stomach churned with unease. "This is who they send?" Krell's voice modulator vibrated with skepticism. "One human? For the most critical negotiation in 50 cycles?" Chief Protocol Officer Zorna fluttered her tendrils in the Vexillian equivalent of a shrug. Coalition Central was quite clear. The human is merely here to translate, nothing more. And yet, Krell's voice trailed off as he watched the airlock cycle open. The human stepped through, carrying only a small satchel. No weapons were visible, though that meant little when it came to humans. The stories Krell had heard about the Zarn incident still caused his dorsal ridges to tingle with unease. Tom Walker approached with a measured gait, stopping at the precisely appropriate distance for formal greetings. Not close enough to suggest familiarity, not far enough to indicate fear. His eyes, unnervingly fixed in their sockets, unlike the properly mobile optical organs of civilized species, scanned the delegation before settling on Krell. "Ambassador," Tom said, inclining his head in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both respect and equality. "Thomas Walker, Coalition Diplomatic Corps, Translation Division. I'm honored to serve as linguistic facilitator for these negotiations." Krell extended a ceremonial greeting tendril. "The honor belongs to Vexos Prime, Translator Walker, though I must admit, we had expected more." Tom's face formed the human expression known as a smile, a gesture that had historically caused considerable confusion among non-human species, given its remarkable similarity to threat displays in several predatory coalition races. "One translator is all that's needed, Ambassador. My role is simple: to ensure accurate communication between your people and the Grain delegation." Zorna stepped forward, her official protocol sash glittering under the station's lights. "The Grain prefer to be called by their proper name, Translator Walker. They find the term Kraken to be inflammatory." Tom nodded. "Of course. My apologies for the error." But Krell noted that the human's eyes had narrowed slightly. There was something in that expression, something Krell couldn't quite identify. "The Grain delegation arrives in 6 station hours," Zorna continued. "You will be shown to your quarters to prepare. The ceremonial chambers have been configured according to both Vexillian and Grain preferences." "And human preferences?" Tom asked, his tone light. Zorna's tendrils curled in confusion. "You are only here to translate." "Of course," Tom said, that peculiar smile returning. "Just translate." As they led the human through the spinning corridors of the Celestial Peace Station, Krell couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The mineral moons of Vexos Prime had been contested for 50 cycles, their rare elements crucial to both Vexillian and Grain technological advancement. 3 previous attempts at negotiation had ended in failure, the last nearly culminating in open warfare when the Grain negotiator had misinterpreted a Vexillian greeting posture as a dominance challenge. The Grain, known throughout the sector for their rigid honor codes and absolute refusal to compromise, had been growing increasingly aggressive in their orbital posturing. Their warships now hovered at the edge of the Vexos system, a perpetual reminder of the threat they posed. The Vexillians, while technologically sophisticated, could not hope to match Grain military might. This negotiation represented perhaps the final chance to avoid bloodshed. And now, the fate of millions rested partly on the narrow shoulders of a single human translator. Your species has a curious reputation in diplomatic circles. Translator Walker, Krell said as they approached the guest quarters. Humans are said to be unpredictable. Tom adjusted the strap of his satchel. We prefer to think of ourselves as adaptable. Ambassador. The distinction escapes me. Predictability requires rigid patterns, Tom explained. Adaptation requires understanding the patterns of others. In my experience, the latter is more useful in translation work. They reached the humans' assigned quarters, a space hastily reconfigured to approximate Earth atmospheric conditions and gravity. Tom paused at the entrance, turning to face Krell. Ambassador, if I may ask, what do you hope to achieve in these negotiations? The question caught Krell off guard. That hardly seems relevant to your function. Translator. On the contrary, Tom said quietly. To translate effectively, I must understand the heart of what each side truly desires to say. Words alone are insufficient. Krell's inner membranes fluttered with discomfort. We desire peace, naturally, and fair access to the mineral resources of our moons. All 14 moons? They orbit Vexos Prime, Krell said stiffly. They are, by cosmic right, ours. Tom nodded, his expression neutral. And the Grayan? What do they desire? The same moons, the same minerals. But they have no claim. They are interlopers, expansionists. Krell's voice, modulator, betrayed his agitation. They believe might makes right. I see. Tom's gaze lingered on Krell for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then tomorrow, we shall see what words can achieve where force has failed. With that, the human entered his quarters, the door sliding shut behind him. Zorna waited until they were well away before speaking. He asks too many questions for a mere translator. Indeed, Krell agreed, his membranes still fluttering. Keep surveillance active in his quarters. I want to know if he contacts anyone. Already done, Zorna assured him. Though the human appears to have brought nothing suspicious. It's not what he brought that concerns me, Krell said. It's what he knows. The diplomatic chambers of the Celestial Peace Station had been carefully designed to accommodate diverse physiologies and cultural sensitivities. The main negotiation table, a massive oval of synthetic crystal, sat at the center of a gently rotating platform, surrounded by atmospheric containment fields that could be individually adjusted for each delegation's comfort. Krell and his team of 5 advisors arrived early, positioning themselves at the western arc of the table. Tom Walker arrived precisely on time, taking his place at a small auxiliary station positioned between the 2 main delegations. Translator Walker, Krell acknowledged. I trust your accommodations were satisfactory. More than adequate, Ambassador, Tom replied, arranging several small devices on his station. I took the liberty of reviewing the historical context of these negotiations. Fascinating material. Before Krell could respond, the chamber's main doors slid open with a hiss. The Grain delegation had arrived. Krell had encountered Grain diplomats before, but the sight of them still sent an involuntary ripple through his dermal sacs. 6 Grain entered, massive, armored figures that seemed more suited to a battlefield than a negotiation chamber. Their exoskeletons gleamed with ceremonial markings, and each wore a harness festooned with what Krell knew to be trophies from past conflicts. At their head strode General Doctress Supreme Commander of the Grain Expeditionary Forces. Unlike his subordinates, Dra wore minimal ornamentation, only a single pendant, fashioned from what appeared to be a fragment of skull. The simplicity of his appearance only emphasized his fearsome reputation. Dra had personally led the conquest of 3 star systems before turning his attention to Vexos Prime. The Grayan took their positions without ceremony, their massive forms dwarfing the Vexillian delegation across the table. General Dra's compound eyes, fixed on Krell, with unsettling intensity. Zorna, as Chief Protocol Officer, initiated the proceedings. In accordance with Coalition peacekeeping statutes, this negotiation chamber is declared neutral territory. All participants are bound by the Treaty of Rigel to abstain from hostile actions. Translation services will be provided by Coalition Representative Thomas Walker. Tom nodded respectfully to both delegations. Krell noticed that the human showed no sign of intimidation in the presence of the grain, an unusual reaction. Most beings experienced at least some primal fear response when confronted with the predatory aliens. General Draw spoke, his voice a grating vibration that seemed to resonate through the chamber itself. The sound was untranslatable to Vexillian auditory organs. Tom listened intently, then turned to Krell. General Draw extends formal greetings on behalf of the Grain hegemony. He acknowledges the sacred nature of these negotiations and pledges to observe all protocols. The human's voice was neutral, professional. Krell responded with the formal Vexillian greeting, which Tom then translated for the Grain delegation. So far, everything proceeded according to protocol. Then Draw spoke again, longer this time, his mandibles clicking in what Krell recognized as a gesture of dominance. The Grain commander leaned forward, one clawed appendage tapping rhythmically on the crystal table. Tom's expression remained impassive as he listened. When Draw finished, the human turned to Krell, but his voice had taken on a new, measured quality. General Diarra states that the time for extended negotiation has passed. The Grain hegemony claims all 14 mineral moons of Vexos Prime by right of superior strength and cosmic mandate. He offers the following terms: complete Vexillian withdrawal from all 14 moons within 30 cycles, with mineral rights transferring entirely to the Grain. In exchange, the hegemony will permit Vexos Prime to maintain its independence and current territorial holdings in the rest of the system. A shocked silence fell over the Vexillian delegation. This was not a negotiation offer. It was an ultimatum. Krell's primary heart sac contracted painfully. This is outrageous. The moons have been Vexillian territory for 15 generations. We cannot— Ambassador, Tom interrupted quietly, if I may. Krell fell silent, startled by the human's breach of protocol. Translators were not permitted to interject their own comments. Tom turned to face General Draw directly. And then, to everyone's astonishment, he began to speak in the harsh, guttural language of the Grain, not just basic phrases, but fluent, complex sentences. The Grain delegation stirred, clearly surprised. Draw's compound eyes narrowed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. Tom continued, his human vocal apparatus somehow managing to produce the correct harmonic resonances of Grain battle speech. Krell could not understand the words, but he recognized one phrase that Tom repeated: Kranak Vortal, a Grain term referring to the skull fragments worn by warriors. When Tom finished speaking, General Draw remained motionless for several long moments. Then, unexpectedly, the Grain commander emitted a sound that Krell had never heard from their species before, a low, rumbling vibration that seemed almost contemplative. Draw responded in his native tongue, his posture subtly altered. Tom turned back to the Vexillian delegation. The general acknowledges my unexpected familiarity with Grain battle speech. He has agreed to hear the Vexillian position before finalizing terms. Zorna leaned close to Krell. What just happened? What did the human say to him? I don't know, Krell whispered, but I believe we have just been granted a reprieve. The negotiations proceeded, but the dynamic had subtly shifted. Whenever Draw would make an aggressive statement, Tom would translate it accurately, but would occasionally add linguistic flourishes that seemed to moderate the Grain's tone, without changing the content of his messages. More remarkably, the human continued to address Draw directly in the Grain language when translating Vexillian responses. sometimes using phrases that caused visible reactions among the grain delegation. During a brief recess, Krell confronted Tom in a private chamber. "What did you say to General Draw?" Krell demanded. "You spoke to him in his own language, a clear violation of translator neutrality protocols." Tom's expression remained composed. "I merely introduced myself properly, according to grain custom. I noted that I had studied their language extensively, including their battle speech dialects, and expressed my admiration for their cultural traditions." "That cannot be all," Krell pressed. "Draw was prepared to issue an ultimatum. Now he appears receptive." Tom hesitated, then spoke more quietly. "I also happened to mention that I was familiar with the General's collection of Cranach Vortal, particularly the fragment he wears from the Battle of Carnash Nebula. I expressed how honored I was to be in the presence of a warrior whose victories are known even to distant Earth." Krell's translator implant struggled with the grain term. "Cranach Vortal?" "Trophy skulls," Tom explained. "Fragments taken from worthy opponents. It's a sacred practice in grain culture, not mere barbarism as many assume. Each fragment represents not just a victory, but a worthy adversary whose strength now belongs symbolically to the victor." "And how could you possibly know about Draw's specific trophies?" Tom's smile returned, enigmatic. "Coalition intelligence briefings are quite thorough, Ambassador, and I make it my business to understand the cultural significance behind language. Words without context are merely noise." Krell studied the human with new appreciation. "You were not sent here merely to translate, were you?" "That is precisely my job description," Tom replied evenly. "Now, shall we return? The grain value punctuality as a sign of respect." When negotiations resumed, Krell found himself watching Tom as much as the grain delegation. The human's translations remained technically accurate, but Krell began to notice subtle choices in phrasing, ways of conveying Vexillian concerns that seemed to resonate with grain cultural values. When Krell expressed Vexillian territorial claims, Tom translated them as matters of ancestral honor. When discussing resource allocation, the human framed Vexillian needs in terms of strength preservation rather than economic necessity. Small linguistic choices, but they seemed to prevent the grain from dismissing Vexillian positions outright. As the session progressed, General Draw made a statement that Tom translated with particular care. General Draw states that while the grain maintain their claim to all 14 moons, they might consider a temporary arrangement allowing Vexillian mining operations to continue on some of them, under grain supervision, of course. It was a small concession, but more than any grain negotiator had offered in previous talks. Krell seized the opportunity, proposing a joint survey mission to determine which moons contain the most valuable mineral deposits. As Tom translated this proposal, he subtly incorporated references to coalition defense pacts that guaranteed Vexillian sovereignty, a diplomatic reminder of the potential consequences should the grain choose military action over negotiation. Raw's response was measured, suggesting that such a survey could be conducted primarily by grain specialists, with Vexillian observers. Again, not ideal, but a step away from the initial ultimatum. As the day's negotiations drew to a close, Krell felt a cautious optimism. The talks had not collapsed, and the grain had shown an unexpected willingness to engage in actual negotiation rather than mere dictation of terms. That night, as Krell prepared a report for the Vexillian High Council, Zorna burst into his quarters, her tendrils quivering with alarm. "The human is gone!" Krell's secondary heart fluttered. "What do you mean, gone?" "Translator Walker left his quarters 3 hours ago," Zorna explained breathlessly. "He disabled our surveillance devices somehow. We've searched the common areas of the station. No sign of him." "The Gran," Krell whispered. "Could they have taken him?" "Impossible," Zorna insisted. "The security barriers between delegation quarters are impenetrable." "Then where?" Krell's communication implant chimed, interrupting him. A text-only message appeared in his visual field. Continuing translation duties through alternative channels. Will return for morning session. He's contacting the coalition, Krell speculated. Perhaps seeking additional instructions. Zorna's tendrils twisted skeptically. Without informing us? That violates protocol. Little about Translator Walker seems to adhere strictly to protocol, Krell observed. Yet his methods, unorthodox as they are, have yielded more progress in one day than we achieved in 3 previous negotiations. You trust this human? Zorna sounded incredulous. Krell considered the question carefully. Not trust, precisely. But I begin to understand why the coalition sent him. There is more to translation than converting words from one language to another. And if he doesn't return? Then we proceed as before, Krell said grimly. But I suspect our chances of a peaceful resolution would diminish considerably. Morning arrived, and with it, the scheduled resumption of negotiations. The Vexillian delegation took their positions, acutely aware of the empty translator station. General Draw and his Grain counterparts entered precisely on time, their posture suggesting expectation rather than surprise at the human's absence. Zorna leaned toward Krell. Should I announce a delay? Before Krell could respond, the chamber's side entrance slid open, and Tom Walker entered. Krell barely recognized the human. Tom's face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. A fresh cut across his forehead had been sealed with medical adhesive, but traces of dried blood remained on his skin. His coalition uniform was torn in several places, and his movements suggested injured ribs or internal organs. Yet, despite his battered appearance, Tom walked directly to his station with a steady gait, nodding respectfully to both delegations as if nothing were amiss. Translator Walker, Krell began, shocked by the human's condition. What happened to you? Tom arranged his translation devices calmly. A productive cultural exchange, Ambassador. Shall we begin? Before Krell could press further, General Draw rose from his seat, a gesture of respect that no Grain had ever shown in previous negotiations. The massive alien spoke, his voice somehow less harsh than before. Tom translated smoothly, despite his injuries. General Draw extends greetings and expresses his admiration for Vexillian patience. He proposes that today's session focus on identifying specific resources required by each delegation, rather than territorial claims. Krell stared in disbelief. This was a complete reversal of the Grain's previous position. Throughout the morning session, the change in tone was remarkable. Where the Grain had demanded total control of all 14 moons, they now discussed potential sharing arrangements. Where they had previously dismissed Vexillian historical claims, they now acknowledged the legitimacy of ancestral connections to the Vexo system. During a midday recess, Krell cornered Tom in a private communication alcove. You must explain, Krell insisted. Where were you last night? How did you sustain these injuries? And what have you done to alter the Grain position so dramatically? Tom touched the wound on his forehead gingerly. I visited the Grain quarters. That's impossible, Krell said. The security barriers were designed to prevent forced entry, not invited guests. Tom finished. I requested an audience with General Doctra. He granted it. For what purpose? Tom's uninjured eye met Krell's gaze directly. To participate in the Grain bonding ritual known as Kravash. Roughly translated, truth through pain. Krell's translator implant struggled with the concept. You fought with General Draw? Not exactly fought, Tom corrected. The ritual involves demonstrating one's worthiness to negotiate by enduring ceremonial challenges, headbutting contests, blood oaths, ritual scarification, tests of endurance. You subjected yourself to Grain dominance rituals? Krell was aghast. Why would you do such a thing? Because in Grain culture, only those who have proven their strength have the right to speak as equals. Tom explained patiently. By submitting to their rituals voluntarily, I earned the right to be heard, not just as a translator, but as a representative of coalition interests. But you were sent here only to translate, Krell protested. Tom smiled through his bruised lips. And I am translating, Ambassador. Not just words, but cultures. The grain respects strength above all else, but they define strength differently than most species understand it. They expected me to refuse their challenges, to hide behind coalition neutrality protocols. By accepting instead, I demonstrated a form of strength they rarely encounter, the willingness to endure pain for a greater purpose. You could have been killed. The risk was calculated, Tom said. Grain rituals are harsh, but not typically lethal for invited participants, and the potential benefit outweighed the danger. Krell's tendrils curled in reluctant admiration. The coalition did not send you here simply for your linguistic skills, did they? My job description is quite clear, Tom replied evenly. I am here to facilitate accurate communication between parties. Communication is more than words, Krell observed. Precisely, Tom agreed. Now, shall we return? I believe General Draw is prepared to discuss specific moon allocations. The afternoon session progressed with unprecedented cooperation. The grain, having witnessed Tom's willingness to participate in their cultural rituals, extended a similar respect to Vexillian traditions. When Krell proposed a formal water-sharing ceremony, a Vexillian custom symbolizing mutual dependency, General Draw agreed without hesitation. As negotiations continued, Tom translated with increasing fluency despite his injuries. Krell noticed that the human occasionally used idioms and cultural references from both Vexillian and grain traditions, creating a linguistic middle ground where complex concepts could be shared accurately. By day's end, a framework had emerged. 6 moons would fall under grain administration, 8 under Vexillian control, with joint mining operations and profit-sharing arrangements on all 14. It was a compromise that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. As the session concluded, General Draw approached Tom directly. The massive grain towered over the battered human, but there was no menace in his posture. Draw extended one clawed appendage, upon which rested a small object, a fragment of polished bone. Tom accepted the offering with evident understanding of its significance, inclining his head in the precise angle of grain respect. No words were exchanged, but the meaning was clear to all present. The human had earned a place in grain cultural memory. That evening, Tom proposed something unprecedented, a joint banquet with both delegations present. Such an event has never occurred, Zorna objected. The atmospheric requirements alone can be managed with portable respirators for the duration of a meal, Tom countered. The symbolic value of breaking bread together, or the equivalent in each species' cuisine, cannot be overstated. Krell, emboldened by the day's progress, supported the proposal. If Translator Walker believes this will strengthen our agreement, I am willing to participate. To everyone's surprise, the Grind also accepted the invitation. The station's central atrium was hastily converted into a banquet space, with separate food preparation areas for each species' dietary requirements. At Tom's suggestion, the lighting was adjusted to a spectrum comfortable for both Vexillian and grain visual organs. A warm amber glow that softened the harsh lines of the station architecture. The delegations arrived separately, but were seated at a single, long table, with Tom positioned at the center. Despite initial awkwardness, the human skillfully guided conversation toward shared interests, stellar phenomena, technological innovations, and ancient myths that seemed to have curious parallels across species. Midway through the meal, Tom rose from his seat, visibly wincing from his injuries, but maintaining his composure. He raised a drinking vessel containing a clear liquid. In human tradition, he announced, we mark significant agreements with a toast, a shared drink accompanied by words of commitment. He spoke first in Vexillian, then repeated the same statement in the Grind language. Today, we have accomplished what many believed impossible, a framework for peace that honors the strength and heritage of both great civilizations represented here. Again, he translated his own words into both languages. I propose that this agreement be commemorated not just in documents, but in a physical monument to be constructed on Vexos Prime, a symbol of cooperation visible from both Vexillian and Grain territories. General Draw's mandibles clicked thoughtfully before he responded. Tom translated for the Vexillians. General Draw proposes that such a monument take the form of two hands clasped in the warrior's grip. One Vexillian, one Grain, fashioned from minerals extracted from all 14 moons. Krell found himself moved by the proposal. We accept this vision, with the condition that the monument bear inscriptions in both our languages. And in human language as well, Draw added through Tom's translation, to honor the bridge that made understanding possible. The banquet continued late into the station's night cycle. As formal conversation gave way to more personal exchanges, Tom encouraged members of each delegation to share cultural stories. A Grain subcommander recited a battle poem celebrating an ancient victory. A Vexillian science attaché demonstrated a traditional water-weaving ritual. By the time the gathering dispersed, something remarkable had occurred. The beginnings of genuine curiosity between species that had previously known each other only through the lens of conflict. The final day of negotiations was devoted to formalizing the agreement. Legal experts from both delegations worked together to draft language acceptable to their respective governments. Tom moved between groups, ensuring that technical terms were properly understood and that cultural nuances were respected in the final document. When at last the treaty was ready, it was printed on 3 physical pages, a Vexillian tradition that honored the permanence of important agreements. General Draw applied the Grain seal without hesitation, a press of his armored claw, into soft mineral clay. Krell added the Vexillian mark, a tendril impression preserved in specialized resin. As witnesses, each member of both delegations added their signatures or equivalent markings. Last to sign was Tom Walker, who inscribed his name in all 3 languages beneath the title Coalition Translator. When the ceremony concluded, the assembled diplomats broke into spontaneous applause, a gesture that transcended species differences. Krell noticed that even Zorna, ever the protocol purist, joined in the celebration. In the days that followed, news of the agreement spread throughout the Vexos system. Production projections indicated a 47% increase in mineral extraction efficiency under the new cooperative arrangement. Cultural exchange programs were already being planned, with Vexillian scientists scheduled to visit Grain engineering academies, and Grain military historians invited to study Vexillian ancestral records. On the final morning of his stay, Tom Walker prepared to depart the Celestial Peace Station. His injuries had begun to heal, though the cut on his forehead would likely leave a permanent scar. Krell accompanied the human to the departure bay, his normally reserved demeanor softened by the events of the past week. The Coalition will be pleased with the outcome, Krell observed. You have achieved what 3 previous diplomatic missions could not. Tom secured his satchel, still his only luggage. The Coalition will indeed be satisfied with the treaty, though I expect some bureaucratic displeasure regarding my methods. Surely your superiors will recognize the necessity of your unorthodox approach. Coalition bureaucracy values procedure as highly as results, Tom said with a wry smile. My performance review will likely note excessive cultural engagement and protocol violations, alongside satisfactory outcome. Krell's tendrils curled in disbelief. That seems remarkably ungrateful. It's the nature of large organizations, Tom said philosophically. The further one gets from the battlefield, diplomatic or otherwise, the easier it becomes to prioritize rules over results. The departure alert sounded, indicating that Tom's transport was ready for boarding. Before you go, Krell said, I must ask, When you negotiated with General Draw during the Kravash ritual, what argument finally convinced him to compromise? Tom considered the question carefully. It wasn't an argument in the traditional sense. During the ritual, there is a moment when both participants are exhausted, when pride and posturing fall away. In that moment, I shared a truth the grain rarely consider, that cooperation yields greater strength than conquest. And he accepted this from a physically weaker species? The grain respect perseverance over raw power, Tom explained. By enduring their challenges, not defeating them, but simply refusing to yield, I demonstrated a form of strength they could recognize. It opened a channel for genuine exchange. Krell extended a formal farewell tendril. You came here to translate words, Thomas Walker. Instead, you translated something far more valuable: understanding. Tom clasped the tendril briefly, in the human gesture of handshaking. That has always been the true purpose of translation. As the human boarded his transport, Krell remained in the observation area, watching until the small vessel disappeared into the starfield. He found himself reflecting on the monument that would soon stand on Vexos Prime. Two clasped hands, formed from the very minerals that had nearly driven their civilizations to war. The symbolism seemed especially fitting now. Tom Walker had come to the Celestial Peace Station covered in blood by the end, but it had been his own blood, willingly given in service to peace. And he had departed amid applause that celebrated not victory over an enemy, but the discovery of common ground. Krell had never understood humans' reputation for unpredictability. Now, he thought perhaps it was better described as adaptability, the rare ability to bridge worlds by becoming, for a time, a part of each. As Krell turned to resume his duties, he made a mental note to request Thomas Walker, specifically should the Vexillians ever again require the services of a coalition translator. Something told him that the human would not be difficult to find, wherever cultures clashed and understanding faltered, wherever words alone proved insufficient. After all, he was just there to translate.